They called her crippled. They called her debt. And the crowd roared, as if cruelty had become a sport, as if a woman's dignity could be traded for whiskey and a laugh. But what they didn't know is that the man who stepped out of the shadows that day wasn't there to buy her. He came to reclaim something the world had long forgotten: mercy. What happened next tore a town in two, tested the heart of one man, and proved that love can still grow from the ashes of humiliation. Stay with me for just 1 minute, and I'll tell you how one quiet act of courage changed everything. If you believe kindness still has a place in this weary world, subscribe to Healing Stories of Hope and share how this story made you feel. And wherever you're watching from tonight, may peace find your doorstep, and may your heart always remember how to stand for the broken. The noon sun had no mercy that day. It hung over Dustwater Crossing like a fiery eye, glaring down on the town square until every shadow was flattened, every sound sharpened to cruelty. The air trembled with heat and flies. The smell of sweat, horses, and stale whiskey hung thick over the crowd. Men barked numbers over cattle, wagers, and women alike, each syllable ringing against the dry boards of the platform where dignity went to die. Somewhere between the shouts and the dust, a woman stood alone, but for 3 small figures clinging to her torn skirt. Anna McCrae, 28. Fair once, though the sun had stolen that softness long ago. Her hair, once copper bright, was dull with dust. Her dress, plain calico patched at the knees, hung loose on a body worn thin by hunger. She leaned on a single crutch oak polished by necessity, its end biting deep into the splintered wood of the auction platform. Beside her, 3 children triplets, 6 years old, identical in bone and fear, stood barefoot, wide-eyed, their small faces streaked with dust and tears. They did not cry loudly. Children born to hardship rarely did. The auctioneer's voice cracked through the air like a whip. $1,000 owed by the late Thomas McCrae to Mr. Hank Berryman of Dustwater Crossing. His hat sat crooked over a sunburned scalp, and sweat trickled down his neck into the folds of his collar. The man grinned, revealing teeth yellowed by tobacco. The widow and her young'uns stand as collateral until the debt's satisfied. Any objections? None came. Only a ripple of dry laughter from the men below. Hank Berryman himself leaned against a post near the edge of the crowd, a thick-set brute with a gut of indulgence and a face that glowed red from liquor. His vest strained against his belly. A gold chain swung from his pocket as he spat into the dust. "Ain't no objections, Clancy," he drawled. "The widow knows the deal. She pays in labor, or she pays with years." Anna said nothing. Words had lost their worth long ago. She kept her gaze fixed on the horizon, where heat shimmered over the far hills, and tried to keep the trembling of her hands hidden from her children. The smallest of the 3, a boy named Eli, pressed his cheek against her leg and whispered, "Mama, can we go home now?" She did not answer. There was no home left. The gavel struck the table once. "Sold until the debt's clear," the auctioneer barked. The crowd clapped half-heartedly, like men applauding their own decay. Hank stepped forward, his boots thudding heavy against the boards. He reeked of whiskey and victory. "We'll start at my ranch come mornin'," he said, his tone thick with ownership. But before his hand could touch her arm, a sound cut through the heat, slowly, steady, deliberate. The sound of boots. The square quieted. Even the horses were still. From the shade of the blacksmith's porch, a tall man stepped into the sun. Dust clung to his long coat the color of baked clay, and his hat cast a line of shadow across his eyes. He walked with the measured calm of a man who'd seen too much and spoken too little. His face, sun-cracked and strong-jawed, bore the gray of road dust in his stubble. His gaze was the hard blue of desert sky after rain. Jace Callen, 35, a cattleman from the northern ridge. Folks knew him, though not well knew he'd lost his family to the last fever, knew he kept to himself and rode alone. They said he'd once fought for the Union, that he still carried ghosts under his coat. But gossip fell silent when he moved. He stopped before the auction stand. Without a word, he reached into his pocket and drew out something small that glinted silver in the sun. It wasn't money. It was a necklace, a delicate chain with a single oval pendant worn smooth by years of touch. He placed it on the table in front of the auctioneer. "I'll settle her debt," he said. The words were quiet, but they landed heavy. Hank barked a laugh. "You'll what? That woman's worth more in labor than—" "I said I'll settle it," Jace repeated, eyes steady, voice like gravel rolled through water. The auctioneer hesitated. "That ain't near 1,000, Mr. Callen. Not by half." "It's all I've got that's worth anything," Jace said, his tone low, almost gentle. "And that's more than what this is worth to you." A hush fell. Even the flies seemed to stop mid-air. Hank's smirk faltered, and he glanced around, as if seeking someone to laugh with him, but no one did. The crowd watched, uneasy, sensing a weight they couldn't name. Jace's hand lingered on the table for a moment, before pulling away, leaving the silver pendant glinting like a drop of mercy in a desert of greed. "You take it," he said quietly, "and you mark the debt paid." The auctioneer swallowed. The sun hammered down. Somewhere a dog barked, then went silent. Hank's face turned purple. "You think you can just walk in and—" "I think," Jace interrupted, calm and cold, "you've already taken enough from the dead." The silence that followed was not peace. It was warning. A heat heavier than sunlight hung in the air. Hank's fingers twitched toward his belt, but something in Jace's gaze made him stop. The cattleman didn't move, didn't reach for a gun. He only stood, tall and still, the kind of stillness that makes lesser men remember their sins. At last, the auctioneer cleared his throat and nodded once. "Debt's cleared." The gavel came down. Crack. The sound carried across the square like a shot. Jace turned to leave, but not before glancing at Anna just once. Her eyes met his, gray-green and storm-bitten. He didn't smile. He didn't bow. He simply held her gaze long enough for her to see that he wasn't buying her. He was undoing something. Anna didn't know what to say. Words crowded her throat, none finding air. The triplets clung tighter to her skirt, their faces half hidden. For the first time in months, she felt the strange weight of someone else's decency pressing against her fear. As Jace walked away, Hank cursed under his breath and spat into the dust. "You'll regret crossing me, Callen," he hissed. Jace didn't turn. "I already regret enough." The crowd parted to let him pass. Behind him, the sun flared bright on the silver pendant lying on the table, a glint that seemed to pulse between right and ruin. Anna stood still, her crutch biting into the wood, her children silent at her side. The world had not changed, but something within her had shifted, faint as breath. For the first time that day, she lifted her head. Not toward salvation, but toward the man who hadn't looked away. And as the gavel's echo faded into the dust, the world tilted just slightly on its axis. Anna McCrae had been bought again only this time, by a man who refused to name a price. The wagon moved slow through the half-light, its wheels moaning against the ruts of the trail. The evening air had cooled, but the heat of the day still clung to the dust, turning every breath into a memory of hardship. The world was hushed now, save for the creak of wood and the rhythmic clop of Jace's horse ahead. Anna sat in the wagon bed with her children pressed close against her side, the youngest asleep against her arm, the other two staring at the pale stripe of sky fading above the tree line. Every jolt of the wheel felt like a question she didn't dare ask where they were going, what came next, or how long this silence could hold before it broke. Jace rode slightly ahead, his outline dark against the burning horizon. He didn't look back often, but when he did, the reins hung loose in his hand, his posture straight, unhurried, as though he trusted the road to decide for him. His horse, a tall, dapple-gray gelding with a scar across one flank, moved with the tired patience of long miles. From where she sat, Anna could see how his shoulders carried not pride but weight, a kind of quiet endurance born from too many winters alone. The sun finally dipped behind the ridge, bleeding its last light into the pines. The air turned cool, sharp with the scent of sap and rain-soaked soil. Then, out of the twilight, a cabin emerged, a humble silhouette tucked beneath the whispering crowns of tall pines. Smoke curled lazily from a crooked chimney, catching the faint indigo glow of the evening. The clearing around it was small, fenced by rough-hewn rails, with a barn slouching a few yards away, like an old companion long past its prime. Jace dismounted without a word and came to the wagon. His hands, rough from work yet careful as if handling glass, lifted each child in turn, first Eli, then Ruth, then Samuel, and carried them inside. He spoke softly to them, though Anna couldn't make out the words, only the tone. Steady, kind, almost unfamiliar in this world. When the last child was laid on a cot near the hearth, Jace turned back and helped Anna down, his palm firm but unassuming. She winced as her crutch hit the ground, the old wound reminding her that mercy often came with pain. He handed her a tin cup filled from the water bucket. "You and the kids stay here tonight," he said, voice even and low. "I'll be in the barn." Then he was gone, his footsteps receding into the hush of the pines. Inside, the cabin smelled of pine resin and ashes long cooled. The floorboards were uneven, the furniture plain but sturdy. 2 cots, a table scarred by knives and time, a small iron stove that still breathed a faint warmth. On one wall hung an old horseshoe, above it a faded photograph of a woman and a boy, both smiling as if time had not yet learned to take. Anna brushed her fingers over the frame but drew back quickly, as though trespassing on memory. Night deepened. She sat by the hearth, her children asleep at her side, the fire whispering, low. She waited for the sound that always came after kindness, the knock on the door, the demand, the price. But none came. Only the wind found its way through the cracks, humming gently like a lullaby too shy to finish. The stillness unnerved her. Mercy was not supposed to be this quiet. When dawn crept over the ridge, Anna was already awake. Sleep had hovered but never settled. She rose carefully, tying her hair back with a strip of linen, and began to move through the cabin. She scrubbed the floor with her skirt hem until the boards gleamed, hauled buckets of water from the well, stoked the fire until the stove growled awake. Every motion was a vow to prove her worth, to repay what could not be measured in silver or pity. The metal brace at the end of her leg chafed raw against the skin, and pain pulsed with each step, but she welcomed it as something she could still control. She boiled water, mended a torn sleeve, and gathered the children's shoes by the door. Small efforts arranged like apologies to a man who hadn't asked for any. Outside, the morning wind carried the scent of damp earth and horses. The sound of a hammer echoed faintly from the barn. Hours passed before Jace appeared in the doorway. He filled it with completely broad shoulders framed by morning light, coat unbuttoned, hair damp from the trough. For a long while he didn't speak. He just watched her, his face unreadable, the kind of stillness that made silence feel like conversation. Anna froze, one hand clutching the ladle she'd been using to stir the pot. The children sat quietly on the cot, blinking toward the light. Finally, Jace stepped forward, his boots soft on the clean floorboards. "You don't need to bleed to earn a roof," he said, almost to the air, but his eyes never left her. The words struck harder than any command. Anna's throat closed, her hand trembled, and the ladle clattered against the pot. No one had spoken to her like that in years, with gentleness instead of ownership. She looked down, not trusting her voice. He bent slightly, picked up the ladle, and set it on the table. "This place has seen its share of work," he murmured. "You don't have to add your scars to it." Then he turned toward the door, the morning light catching the faint silver of his belt buckle, and went out again. The rest of the day passed in uneasy quiet. Jace mended a section of the fence, his hammer echoing through the trees. The children followed him for a time, watching with shy fascination, until he handed them each a smooth piece of pine to carve or keep. Anna lingered at the window, torn between gratitude and confusion, between the instinct to repay and the deeper ache of not knowing how. When evening returned, the pines whispered again, their needles shimmering under a bruised blue sky. Anna lit the stove and served what little stew she'd managed to make. Jace ate slowly, wordless, with the deliberate patience of a man unaccustomed to company. The triplets watched him as though studying a creature from another world. He nodded once, thanking her, then rose and went back to the barn without looking back. Night fell. The wind shifted, brushing softly through the eaves, and the cabin settled into stillness once more. Anna sat awake beside the dying fire, her crutch resting against the wall, the children breathing evenly in sleep. The quiet pressed against her chest, not heavy with fear this time, but with something more impossible to wonder. She stared at the door, half expecting a knock that never came. The fire faded to embers, and through the cracks of the window, the stars blinked above the dark pines like eyes that had seen too much and still believed in mercy. When she finally lay down, sleep would not come. The question turned over and over in her mind, restless and tender as the wind outside. Why would a man like him expect nothing in return? And as the first faint light of dawn touched the hills, she still had no answer. The first drops came before dawn. By mid-morning, the rain was no longer falling. It was attacking, thrashing against the cabin roof, as though the sky itself were trying to shake loose its grief. The pines bent and moaned, their tall shadows trembling in the flashes of lightning that tore across the ridge. Inside, the small cabin seemed to hold its breath, each groan of timber echoing like the slow, fearful heartbeat of a home that knew too much suffering. Anna knelt beside the cot where little Eli lay burning. His skin glistened with sweat. His chest rose in shallow, frantic breaths. His brother and sister huddled together in silence near the stove, too frightened to cry. Anna wrung out another cool rag and pressed it against her boy's forehead, whispering prayers she no longer believed could be heard. The storm outside answered with thunder rolling, merciless, a voice of something vast and unfeeling. "Please," she murmured, as if the rain might listen. "Please, not him." When she looked up, Jace was already moving. He stood by the door, pulling on his long brown coat, hat low over his eyes. The lamplight carved deep lines across his face, catching the edge of quiet resolve that fear could not touch. "You can't go out in that," she said, her voice trembling against the wind's howl. He met her gaze for a brief moment. "There's a hollow 2 miles south," he said. "Wild mint grows there. Willow bark too. If I move fast, I can make it before the creeks rise." Anna shook her head. "You'll drown in it." But the door had already opened. Rain swallowed him whole. Hours stretched into something that had no measure. The storm clawed at the roof. Gusts of wind hurled water through the window gaps. Anna worked with desperate hands changing clothes, whispering comfort, keeping the fire alive even as it sputtered in protest. The fever grew hotter. Eli's lips cracked. His eyes rolled under fluttering lids, and each breath came thinner than the last. Outside, the thunder broke and broke again, relentlessly. The triplets' small hands clung to one another, the air thick with the scent of wet smoke and fear. Anna fought to keep herself from shattering, moving only because stopping meant feeling. Then sometime past midnight, a sound came that was not the storm. The latch lifted. Jace stood in the doorway, drenched to the bone, water pooling at his boots. His coat was torn at the shoulder. Mud streaked his arms. In his right hand, he clutched a bundle of dripping wild herbs, roots tangled, leaves torn. Blood darkened his fingers where thorns had pierced the skin. He handed her the bundle. "Boil these," he said simply. No explanation, no heroics. Just command and exhaustion woven together like threads of survival. Anna threw the herbs into the pot, the sharp scent of mint and bark filling the air. Jace knelt beside the boy, his breath ragged, his face pale from the cold. Together, they worked passing clothes, tending the fire, whispering to a child who drifted between this world and somewhere softer. "Stay with us, Eli," Anna whispered, pressing the cool rag once more to his temple. "Stay." The hours that followed bled into each other, the steady crackle of fire, the whisper of fabric, the small sighs of two people who refused to give up. Rain still beat against the windows, but its fury had dulled. It sounded less like anger, more like the tired tears of heaven. When dawn finally came, the light was gray and trembling. Anna leaned close, fingers hovering over her son's chest. The fever had broken. The child slept, his breath deep and even. She turned slowly. Jace sat slumped against the doorframe, his head bowed, eyes half closed. Rain still dripped from his hair onto the floor, but the tension in his face had melted into something almost human, tender, weary, and at peace. "You found them," she said softly, as if afraid the words might wake the storm again. He gave a small shrug, wincing as his shoulder moved. "Sometimes the earth keeps what it needs to heal," he murmured. "You just have to ask the right way." Anna looked at him for a long moment. The lamplight flickered, catching on the faint scars along his knuckles, the tremor in his tired hands. He wasn't just the man who had bought her freedom. He was the man who had earned it, one quiet act at a time, without ever asking to be seen. She wanted to speak to thank him, or to tell him he'd done enough, but her throat refused. Instead, she reached for a dry cloth, pressed it into his bleeding hand. Their fingers touched briefly, rough, calloused, and human. He didn't pull away. Outside, the storm was dying, The rain softened to a whisper, the kind that leaves the world cleaner than before. Through the open door, the pines dripped silver under the new morning light. Jace glanced toward the cot, then back to her. "He'll sleep now," he said quietly. Anna nodded. For a long while, neither of them moved. The silence between them was no longer fragile. It was filled with breath, with gratitude, with something neither dared name. When he finally rose, his legs were unsteady. He stepped out into the pale morning, the rain easing against his shoulders. Anna stood by the doorway, watching him disappear into the mist, and for the first time, she realized that the ache in her chest was not fear anymore. It was something gentler. Trust. And outside, the last echo of thunder rolled away, soft as a sigh. By the time the last frost melted, the valley had changed its skin. Green crept slowly back across the slopes, threading through the brown remnants of winter like forgiveness through an old wound. The creek sang again, swollen with meltwater, and the air smelled of pine resin and wild lilac. Around the cabin, laughter returned, the kind that came in bursts, carried by the triplets as they chased each other through the mud, their shouts echoing against the pines like small, defiant songs. Jace spent the days with quiet purpose. He mended the porch rail that winter had cracked, built stools from split pine, and left small gifts where no one saw him do it. A wooden comb, a carved shawl hook, a small box lined with soft cloth holding socks no bigger than a sparrow's nest. Anna found them each morning, placed neatly by the door, and though she never asked, she folded them into her days like small acts of grace she hadn't known how to name. Peace, it seemed, had finally found its way to them. But peace on the frontier was a fragile thing, soft as petals, easily crushed under the boots of men who mistook kindness for weakness. The first whispers came from town. Dustwater Crossing was small, and stories there spread faster than storms. Folks began to say Jace Callen hadn't paid Hank Berryman in full, that he'd taken a widow and her children out past the ridge, that maybe she hadn't gone of her own will. Every telling added something new, sometimes pity, sometimes poison. And in every telling, Hank's name returned, heavy with resentment and the slow-burning hunger for pride. Hank's anger festered in the tavern corners, in the slurred talk of whiskey-soaked evenings. To him, Jace wasn't a man who'd saved a family. He was a thief who'd stolen his claim, a reminder that decency could expose the rot in a man's soul. Pride, when wounded, doesn't heal. It festers until it bites. So when Travis Greer rode into town, Hank found his chance to let the wound bleed. Travis was a drifter with no roots, no creed, just charm stitched over cruelty. Around 30, tall and lean, with sandy hair that fell across a smirking face and eyes the color of broken glass, cold, sharp, and empty. His boots shone too clean for a man who claimed to ride trails. He spoke with that smooth, honeyed drawl that fooled people until they noticed the rot beneath it. Hank noticed and liked it. "Cabin up the ridge," Hank said, sliding a coin across the bar. "Trade her some herbs, maybe. Ask for eggs. See how my good friend Jace Callen's doing. And Travis makes sure he knows Dustwater hasn't forgotten him." Travis smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. By dusk the next day, a lone rider appeared on the trail beyond the cabin. The pines shivered in a sudden gust, as if they could sense what was coming. Anna stood by the fence, hanging wet laundry, when the sound of hooves broke the still air. "Evening, ma'am," the man called out, dismounting with practiced ease. His horse, a tall bay with a patch of white over its eye, snorted and pawed the ground. "Name's Travis Greer. Just trading my way through. Heard you might have eggs. Got herbs, fine ones. Good for fevers?" Anna hesitated, wiping her hands on her apron. "My children had the fever weeks ago. They're better now." "Well, ain't that fine news?" he said, grin widening, eyes flicking over her face, her hands, the curve of the crutch. "Glad to hear someone out here's doing better than most." His words were sugar. His gaze was not. It lingered too long, dropped where it shouldn't. Anna felt her stomach tighten. The air shifted. She could sense deceit the way a storm senses lightning. Jace stepped out from behind the barn, sleeves rolled, sawdust clinging to his shirt. "You lost?" he asked, voice calm but cold. Travis turned slowly, still smiling. "Just trading, friend. No harm meant." "Then trade somewhere else." The drifter's grin faltered, just a fraction. He tipped his hat, climbed back onto his horse, and rode off. But when he glanced back over his shoulder, his eyes found Anna's again, and she felt the chill of a warning she couldn't yet name. That night, the wind rose. The pines swayed against the dark, and the old boards of the barn creaked as though whispering secrets to each other. Anna couldn't sleep. Somewhere between the howl of wind and the beating of her heart, she thought she saw movement, a shadow crossing the yard. She sat up, holding her breath, the glow of the dying fire painting ghost light across the room. But when she reached the window, there was nothing. Only the restless sway of branches. Morning came pale and brittle. Jace was already outside, feeding the horse, when his boot caught on something at the base of the porch. A knife, long-bladed and thin, jammed deep into the wood. The handle gleamed slick with dew. It wasn't meant to wound. It was meant to remind. Jace pulled it free, his jaw clenched, the muscles along his neck tightening. He turned it in his hand once, then set it on the porch railing. Anna stood in the doorway, her face pale, eyes tracing the scar the blade had left in the wood. "Who would?" she began. He didn't answer. He only looked toward the pines, where the wind carried whispers from a town that had never forgiven him for keeping his decency. Later that afternoon, Jace went to the barn. The air inside was thick with dust and memory. He walked to the far corner, where an old trunk sat beneath a hanging saddle. For a moment, he stood still, hands hovering above the latch. Then he lifted it. The hinges groaned open, releasing the scent of oil and metal. Inside lay relics of a man he'd buried years ago. A folded Union coat, worn thin at the cuffs. A canteen dented from a bullet that had nearly found his heart. And beneath them, a rifle wrapped carefully in oilcloth. Anna appeared in the doorway, the wind behind her, lifting a strand of hair across her cheek. "I thought you left that life behind," she said softly. Jace didn't look up. His fingers traced the rifle's stock, then tightened around it. "I did," he said, "until life found its way back." The words hung in the air like thunder that hadn't yet broken. The rifle gleamed faintly in the dim light, metal catching the breath of the afternoon. It wasn't just a weapon, it was a memory waking from sleep. Outside, the wind rose again, carrying the scent of rain and the promise of trouble. And in the stillness between heartbeats, both of them knew whatever peace they had found was about to be tested. The past had found their trail. The morning came without warning, pale and cold, the kind that steals color from the sky and leaves only resolve. Before the first light brushed the pines, Jace was already in the yard, cinching the saddle straps with a quiet precision that belonged to men who had already made their peace with what must be done. The horse stamped once against the frozen ground, snorting steam into the gray dawn. Anna watched from the doorway, her shawl drawn tight, the hem brushing the floorboards. She didn't speak, neither did he. There was nothing left to say between duty and understanding. He turned once, eyes meeting hers, a wordless promise, steady and unflinching, then touched the brim of his hat in a brief, final nod. A moment later, he rode off through the mist, the sound of hooves fading like the last echo of something sacred. Anna stood long after he was gone, her fingers gripping the doorframe, her heart beating against the silence. She knew where he was headed. The land stretched before him like a reckoning carved in dust and salt. The sun rose slowly and unforgiving, painting the salt flats in blinding white. Wind carried the taste of iron and solitude. Jace rode hard across the ghost valleys, past the bones of cattle half buried in sand, through canyons that whispered names of the dead. He carried no anger, only the purpose, the heavy, quiet kind that doesn't shout or tremble. By the time the town of San Rio appeared, it was near dusk. The place looked like every sin the desert could remember. Paint peeling from saloon walls, horses tethered outside with ribs showing, windows glowing the dull red of cheap whiskey and worse intentions. The streets were half empty, littered with dust and laughter that had long since turned bitter. Jace dismounted slowly, boots sinking into grit. His horse, a scarred gray with patient eyes, nickered softly, as if sensing what its rider carried inside. Jace gave it a firm pat on the neck. "Wait for me," he murmured. Then he walked toward the saloon doors, each step measured, heavy, and unhurried. Inside, the air was thick with smoke and cheap talk. Cards slapped against wood, a piano played somewhere in the corner, its melody drunk and staggering. Behind the bar, a man in a greasy vest polished glasses with the air of someone who'd seen too much and cared too little. At the far table sat Hank Berriman. He was broader than before, heavier too, his face flushed red from whiskey and pride. A bottle sat half empty beside him, his thick fingers wrapped around a glass that shook ever so slightly. Around him lounged the kind of men who mistake cruelty for courage miners, ranch hands, drifters, all of them watching, half curious, half afraid. When Jace entered, the piano faltered. A few heads turned. Someone whispered his name like an old ghost. He walked to the bar, reached into his coat, and set something down that caught the light. A small cloth pouch, heavy with its contents. 4 silver bars, he said, evenly. His voice carried through the room like the sound of a door closing. Hank looked up, eyes narrowing. "That's supposed to mean something?" Jace didn't blink. "For the necklace," he said, "and for her freedom." A ripple moved through the room, chairs creaked, whispers scattered. Hank leaned back, the grin on his face slow and poisonous. "Still not enough," he said. "You think you can walk in here, throw silver at me and make it right? That woman was mine by debt, Callen. You think you can buy decency?" Jace's jaw tightened, but his eyes stayed calm, steady as river stones. "It's not a bargain," he said quietly. "It's justice." The saloon fell utterly still. Even the drunkest man sobered at the sound of those words. Somewhere, the piano player's hands hovered over the keys and didn't dare move. For a heartbeat, it felt like the whole West had stopped to listen. Hank's grin wavered. The silence pressed against him until he could no longer bear it. He spat on the floor, then shoved his chair back with a scraping growl. "Take your damn trinket," he muttered. He reached into his coat, pulled something from his vest pocket, a silver necklace, dulled it with time and hurled it across the table. It landed near Jace's hand, glinting faintly under the lamplight. "Take it," Hank hissed, "and get out of my town." Jace caught the necklace, closed his fingers around it. His expression didn't change. He simply nodded once, turned, and walked out. The door swung shut behind him, muting the hum of voices that began to rise in his wake. Outside, the air was cooler, washed by the faint smell of rain that had yet to fall. Jace stood beside his horse, the silver chain coiled in his hand. The light from the saloon spilled across the dust, flickering like the last heartbeat of a dying fire. He went to mount, then paused. Something on the pendant caught his eye. He turned it over. There, on the back etched into the metal by an unsteady hand, were small, scratched letters, "For the ones who choose mercy." He stared at the words for a long time, the wind tugging gently at his coat. Someone in that town had seen what he'd done, what he'd stood for, and left behind this quiet mark, a prayer carved into silver. For a moment, Jace felt the weight he'd been carrying ease, not because the past was gone, but because something in it had finally been set right. He slid the necklace into his pocket, mounted his horse, and turned toward the open plains. Behind him, Sanrio shrank into the dark. Before him, the horizon stretched wide and endless, washed in the soft gold of a rising dawn. He rode home with the light chasing his heels, the wind warm on his face, and peace honest, earned, and heavy settling at last inside his chest. By the time he returned, the valley had turned gold. Sunlight spilled across the fields like honey over worn wood, and the pines shimmered with a tender light that made even the scars of winter seem forgiven. Dust rose softly behind his horse's hooves, curling through the air in quiet spirals. The road home had never looked so endless, nor so certain. Each mile seemed to hum with a stillness he hadn't known before, a kind of peace that didn't shout, only breathed. The cabin came into view just as the light deepened to amber. Smoke drifted from the crooked chimney, slow and steady, like the pulse of a heart at rest. On the porch, Anna sat in her chair, her crutch resting beside her, the hem of her blue dress glowing with the late light. Her hair, loose from its braid, caught the wind and framed her face in gold. Nearby, the triplets knelt in the grass, weaving crowns of wildflowers, clumsy, uneven circles that seemed somehow perfect in their imperfection. Their laughter drifted through the air, rising and falling like the whisper of spring itself. Jace dismounted quietly. He took a moment, just standing there, watching them. The way Anna's shoulders relaxed when she laughed, the way the children's hands worked with fierce concentration. It was as if the world had stopped demanding something from them, just for this one small day. She looked up when she heard his footsteps. For a heartbeat, she didn't move. Then she reached into her pocket and drew out the necklace. The silver caught the sun and flared bright, flashing between them like a memory made whole. Jace paused at the bottom of the steps. He didn't speak of Sanrio. He didn't need to. The way his coat clung damp with travel, the lines of dust across his boots, the steady calm in his eyes, those told her everything she needed to know. Whatever he had gone to face, he had come back lighter. Anna's voice was a whisper, trembling but sure. "You found it." He nodded once. "I did." For a long moment they stood in silence, the evening wind threading between them. Then he climbed the steps and stopped beside her. His hands were rough, the skin cracked and darkened by sun and work. Hers were pale and scarred, one trembling as she held the necklace toward him. He took it gently, the metal warm from her touch. This was my mother's, he said, his voice low, steady, as though speaking to the wind as much as to her. I gave it up once to save you. Now I give it back, not as a debt, but as a choice. Anna's lips parted, her breath catching like the moment before a prayer. The world seemed to shrink until there was nothing but the sound of his words and the soft rustle of grass in the wind. Her eyes filled, tears trembling in the golden light. She smiled through them. And I choose you. He clasped the chain around her wrist, the silver bright against her skin. For a moment, neither moved. The only sound was the children's laughter, fading as they wandered toward the barn, their crowns slipping over their brows. The sun dipped lower, painting the hills in light so tender it seemed almost human. There was no preacher, only sky. No vows, only the wind moving through the valley like a hymn written for those who had endured enough to understand peace. Jace reached for her hand, and she leaned into him, her head resting against his shoulder. The smell of pine and rain lingered on his coat, the kind of scent that felt like home after a long absence. As twilight gathered, the triplets curled up by the hearth inside, their wildflower crowns scattered on the floor like tiny halos. The fire crackled softly, its glow painting their faces with the innocence of dreams. Anna watched them for a while, her fingers brushing the silver at her wrist, feeling the steady rhythm of its weight, no longer a symbol of debt or loss, but of something earned, something chosen. Outside, Jace stood for a while under the pines, his eyes tracing the horizon where day met night. The wind stirred gently through the needles, whispering over the cabin roof. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled, a deep, far-off murmur that sounded less like a warning now, and more like a sigh. He turned back to the doorway where Anna waited, her figure framed by the warm glow from inside. He smiled, a small, quiet smile that carried all the words he never said aloud. Later, when the dusk folded fully over the valley, they sat together on the porch. The air was cool, filled with the hum of crickets and the faint scent of wild sage. Anna's head rested against his shoulder, her hand still entwined with his. The stars began to bloom one by one above them, each flicker reflected in her eyes. Neither spoke, for some stories end best in silence, the kind that hums like the last note of a song that refuses to fade. Beyond the hills, the storm rolled again, softer now, as if even the sky had found forgiveness. The world, they knew, would go on selling its cruelty, measuring men in debts and women in worth. But here, in this small cabin beyond the pines, love had bought back the price of dignity. And that, at last, was enough. Sometimes the storms that break us are the same ones that teach us how to stand again, not through anger, but through kindness. Not by holding on to what was taken, but by learning how to give back what was lost. Somewhere out there, beyond the dust and the noise of the world, there are still people who choose mercy when they could choose power, who reach out instead of turning away. And maybe that's all the hope we ever need to keep this world from falling apart. If this story touched you even in a quiet way, take a moment to breathe with it. Let it remind you that gentleness is not weakness, and that every small act of care leaves a mark the wind can't erase. Tell us where you're listening from tonight. We'd love to know the corners of the world this little story has reached. And if you'd like to keep walking with us through more tales of courage, love, and quiet redemption, subscribe to the channel and stay a while longer beneath the light of hope.